When our parents first got together, my stepbrother and I were more or less strangers. Luke was 2 years older than me and already in college, while I was still in my senior year of high school. We only saw each other during family holidays and a handful of summer breaks. We were both trying to adjust to this new family dynamic, and since we each had our own routines, it wasn't long before we got used to just coexisting. One weekend, though, everything shifted. Mom and Dad had planned a weekend getaway for their anniversary, which meant Luke and I would be home alone. I didn't think much of it at first. After all, we'd both be busy with our own plans, and it was only a couple of days. But it wasn't long before I noticed that Luke's usual quiet demeanor had shifted. He seemed more attentive, almost friendly. In the past, he'd barely spoken to me beyond small talk, but now he was starting actual conversations and asking about my life. "Want to go to the movies tonight?" He asked casually over dinner. It caught me off guard. I mean, why would he want to hang out with me? Sure. I don't have any other plans," I replied, still a bit wary but curious. "But what made you want to go?" He shrugged, smiling a bit. "I just thought it'd be fun. We never really hang out, and it's not like we have anyone else around this weekend." That night, as we sat in the theater watching the latest action film, I felt an odd tension between us. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it felt new. Every so often, I'd glance over, and there he was, just focused on the movie, looking completely calm. But then he'd catch me glancing, and we'd exchange these awkward smiles. On the way home, it was Luke who brought up how strange it felt, this new sibling bond we were trying to forge. "You know," he said, glancing over at me, "it's kind of funny how we've lived under the same roof for a while now, but barely know each other." I nodded, unsure of what to say. He was right, though. We'd been living as strangers, and now we were suddenly acting like real siblings. But it didn't feel that way. It felt different. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of coffee and the sound of music floating through the kitchen. Luke was already up, leaning casually against the counter, mug in hand and looking relaxed in a way I hadn't seen before. He noticed me walking in and raised his mug with a slight grin. "Morning, sleepyhead," he greeted. "Morning," I replied, slightly amused at the warm welcome. "Didn't think I'd see you up this early." He shrugged. "I thought it'd be nice to make breakfast. Mom usually handles it, and I guess I wanted to see if I was any good at it." For the first time, it felt like we were genuinely starting to open up around each other. As we ate breakfast, we chatted about school, our plans for the future, and even some embarrassing childhood memories. Luke had a way of making everything lighthearted, and I found myself laughing way more than I had in ages. In the afternoon, we decided to go on a hike. It was one of Mom and Dad's favorite trails, a scenic path that looped around a small lake and was surrounded by trees that were just beginning to show signs of autumn. We didn't talk much at first, just walked in a comfortable silence, soaking in the beauty around us. Then, somewhere along the path, Luke turned to me and asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you ever think about what life would have been like if our parents hadn't gotten together?" I thought about it for a moment. "Sometimes," I admitted. I mean, things would definitely be simpler. But also, I think we'd both miss out. This has been weird, but maybe a good kind of weird? He nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, you're right." He looked over at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I think I like this version of things better, even if it's not perfect. After the hike, the easygoing vibe between us started to feel different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a new energy. We'd never spent this much time alone together, and now that we were, there was something unspoken between us that we both seemed to understand, yet neither wanted to acknowledge. That evening, we decided to watch another movie, this time at home. He suggested a classic thriller, and soon we were both curled up on the couch, wrapped in blankets. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to find myself leaning against him, his arm resting around my shoulders. I jolted a bit, realizing how close we were. He didn't move, just glanced down with a soft smile. "You were out for a while there," he said quietly, I didn't want to wake you." "Thanks," I murmured, unsure of how to react. My heart was racing, but I didn't pull away. It felt safe there, like something familiar and yet new. We both sat there in silence, neither of us making a move, neither saying a word about the growing tension. I could feel his arm resting gently around me, the warmth of his hand as it lightly held my shoulder. It was such a small gesture, but one that felt like it held so much. Finally, he cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "You're actually not as bad to hang out with as I thought," he teased, giving my shoulder a gentle squeeze. Maybe this weekend wasn't such a bad idea after all. I laughed, trying to shake off the strange feeling. "Speak for yourself. I was convinced I'd be bored out of my mind with you around." "Guess we both surprised each other," he replied, looking away. But even as he said it, he didn't move his arm. And I didn't ask him to. When the movie ended, I sat up, feeling a little flustered. I think I should head to bed," I said, feeling the need to escape the intensity in the room. But as I stood up, Luke reached for my hand, holding me back for just a moment. "Good night," he said, his voice soft and eyes lingering on mine a little longer than usual. "Good night," I whispered, giving his hand a squeeze before letting go. As I walked away, I felt the weight of his gaze on my back, and I wondered if he felt the same pull that was growing between us. I knew I should brush it off, but something about the way he looked at me stayed with me long after I'd left the room. The next morning, the atmosphere between us felt undeniably different. Even the casual moments, like passing each other in the hallway or brushing hands while reaching for something, seemed loaded. It was as if, in the short span of a weekend, an invisible line had been drawn between us, and we were both teetering right on its edge. Luke seemed quieter than usual during breakfast, his focus drifting from his plate to the window and then back to me, his eyes lingering a little longer than usual. I tried to keep things light, cracking a few jokes and asking about his friends at college, but he responded with short answers, seeming distracted. After a while, he glanced at me and gave a small, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on with me today. I just can't seem to focus." "That makes two of us," I admitted, looking away, feeling the weight of everything unsaid settling between us. After breakfast, he suggested we go for a drive. "Clear our heads," he explained, grabbing his keys. I agreed, thinking the open road and fresh air might make things feel normal again. As we drove, the silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged. The passing scenery blurred as we made our way out of town and onto the winding roads that led to the cliffs overlooking the coast. It was a place our parents loved, and I had been there countless times. But with Luke next to me, it felt like a different world. He parked the car, and we got out to take in the view. The ocean stretched endlessly, waves crashing against the rocks below. For a moment, the vastness of it all felt grounding, a reminder of just how small we were in the grand scheme of things. But as we stood there, I sensed him shifting closer to me. He cleared his throat, finally breaking the silence. "It's funny, isn't it? How close you can feel to someone when you barely knew them before." I turned to look at him, and there was a vulnerability in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. "Yeah," I replied, my voice soft. "It's unexpected." We stood there in silence, each lost in our thoughts. I knew we were both thinking the same thing, but dancing around it, afraid to give voice to something that would change everything. Finally, he spoke. "I think I've been feeling this way for a while. I just didn't realize it until now." His gaze was fixed on the horizon, but his words felt like they were meant for me alone. "Feeling what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear the answer. He hesitated, then gave a small laugh. "I don't know. It's like I feel closer to you than anyone else. And it's strange because we've only just started getting to know each other." There was a pause as I took in his words, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. "I get it," I admitted. "It's like all these years we were living completely separate lives, and now we're just here together." He nodded, glancing down at his hands. "Do you think it's wrong? Feeling this way?" The question hung in the air, heavy and complex. I didn't have an answer, not one that felt easy or right. "I don't know," I whispered. "But I know it doesn't feel bad." He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine as if looking for reassurance. In that moment, the world around us seemed to disappear, leaving just the two of us standing there on the edge of something we couldn't quite define. We stayed like that for a while, neither of us making a move, both aware of the delicate boundary we were teetering on. And yet, something in his gaze told me that he was as caught up in this strange, unspoken connection as I was. When we finally drove back home, the silence in the car felt different. There was an understanding between us, a mutual acknowledgement of the line we were standing on. And though nothing had happened, I knew that things had changed. As we parked and got out of the car, Luke turned to me with a small, hesitant smile. "Thanks for today. It meant a lot." "Me too," I replied, feeling the words fall short of everything I wanted to say. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the day over and over, wondering what would come next, wondering if we would ever talk about it again, or if we would keep living with this unspoken connection, bound by something neither of us fully understood. The final morning of our weekend alone arrived, bringing with it a sense of inevitability. The quiet house seemed filled with the lingering weight of everything unspoken. It felt like something had to be resolved. Whether we moved forward or went back to the way things were, I wasn't sure. But I knew we couldn't keep hovering in this uncertain space. Luke was already up when I came downstairs, pouring coffee and flipping through his phone. When he noticed me, he smiled, but it wasn't the usual easy smile. It was guarded, almost cautious. "Hey," he greeted, setting down his cup. "Sleep okay?" "Yeah, you?" "Barely," he admitted, laughing softly. There was a moment of silence before he spoke again. "You want to go for one last walk? Just to clear the air before Mom and Dad get home?" "Yeah," I agreed, knowing this was our chance to put things to rest. We walked outside into the cool morning air, neither of us saying much as we made our way to the same path we'd hiked the day before. For a while, we simply walked side by side, our footsteps falling into rhythm with each other. Eventually, Luke spoke. "I know things have been different this weekend. I can't really explain it, but I feel like we're both holding on to something we shouldn't be." His honesty surprised me, but I understood what he meant. This strange connection we'd felt over the past few days, it was powerful, but maybe it was meant to be left as a memory. Something we could look back on and smile about, even if it made things complicated now. "I think you're right," I replied. "This whole weekend has been unexpected, but maybe it's better that we let things go back to the way they were before." He looked down, nodding slowly. "It's probably for the best," he said, though I could tell he felt the weight of those words as much as I did. As we walked back to the house, an understanding seemed to settle between us. We would go back to being step-siblings, and whatever had sparked between us would stay in the past. An experience that connected us but didn't define us. When we reached the front door, he turned to me and smiled, his gaze softer than before. "I'll always be here if you need me. You know that, right?" "Same here," I replied, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. We could keep this bond, one grounded in friendship, trust, and understanding. Just as we entered the house, the sound of car tires crunching on gravel signaled Mom and Dad's return. They stepped out of the car, looking happy and relaxed, completely unaware of the weekend's events or the quiet resolution we'd reached. Luke and I exchanged a look as we greeted them, sharing a knowing smile that held everything unspoken, everything that would stay just between us. And as I glanced at him one last time, I knew we'd both carry this weekend with us. Not as something to dwell on, but as a moment that had brought us closer, in ways only we would ever understand.